All right, welcome back to the CompTIA Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to talk about risk management. This is a pretty big topic when it comes to Security Plus, so please make sure that if you need to rewatch this video more than once, please do so. Make sure you're reviewing those flashcards and making sure that you're using the other supplemental materials as you prepare for the Security Plus. So what is risk management? Well, it involves identifying, assessing, and mitigating potential threats and vulnerabilities that could be a negative impact on our organization's assets, operations, or reputation. So what does this mean for organizations? Well, it helps us proactively address challenges, ensuring that resources are allocated effectively to prevent and to respond to incidents. So as we identify risks, we're going to evaluate their potential impact to the organization and implement appropriate safeguards. This way, organizations can protect their critical assets and maintain business continuity. So how do we first do this? The key concepts are broken down into 5 steps. First, we need to do risk identification. This is the process of recognizing potential threats and vulnerabilities that could do harm to our organization, such as malware attacks, insider threats, or even hardware failures. Once we know what risks could affect us, we will need to evaluate each one of those risks on their likelihood and potential impact that we identify. This will help us determine which pose the greatest threat to the organization and prioritize. We then will implement security controls and strategies to reduce the likelihood impact of risks, such as deploying firewalls, encrypting data, or training employees in cybersecurity practices. Once we have our mitigation in place, we can start doing risk monitoring. Risk monitoring is the act of continuously tracking the organization's risk and ensure that any new threats are identified and that the existing controls remain effective. Now, we need to acknowledge that certain risks we're not going to mitigate them, typically because the cost of mitigation will either outweigh the potential impact or is not worth the amount of money we would need to put into it. So what are we working for here? Well, we're trying to prioritize the resources and our efforts to find the most critical utilization of our assets, because we're going to try to minimize our financial losses and even reputational damages from any type of cyber threats or cyber incidents. We need to ensure compliance with legal and regulatory bodies, especially if we work for an organization that is required to follow certain bodies. Think of hospitals and HIPAA and banks and PCI. We then need to maintain our business continuity. And what this means is when we're talking about our CII triad, we have availability. Well, during a cybersecurity event, if we are taken down, how do we return to normal operations as fast as possible? So we need to do a risk assessment, but how often do we need to do it? Well, the organization will conduct these evaluation on any potential security risks. Depending on how critical it is to our environment, depends on how often we complete this. Now, it does depend on a lot of different aspects. And some of those aspects that we need to look at is industry regulation and compliance requirements. Some industries like HIPAA or finance with PCI have strict regulatory standards and dictate how often we need to complete these risk assessments. Regular assessments may be required annually or even more frequently depending on the data that we are using. Next, we look at our size and complexity of our organization. Because the larger our organization, the more complex our IT infrastructure, we may need to perform risk assessments more frequently. A greater number of devices, users, or even networks increases the potential attack surface, which means we will have more vulnerabilities, and we need to help identify and manage them more often. We need to check that any major changes to the organization within the infrastructure, whether or not that's deploying new systems or mitigating or migrating to the cloud itself, that if we're going to introduce any new applications, these can trigger risk assessments. We may need to look into our incident history. Our incident history is all about recent security incidents and breaches, and it should help us ensure, do we need to increase the frequency of our risk assessments or help identify root causes? For instance, in the industry, if we start noticing that academic institutions or hospitals are getting a larger number of ransomware, we may want to focus on that specific ransomware. We also need to make sure that we're looking at emerging threats. This means new types of attacks, whether or not it's more ransomware or additional phishing attempts. We need to understand what kind of threats can occur in our environment and conduct the proper risk assessment to ensure that we're adequately prepared to defend against these new threats. So here's some common schedules in case you were asked on the SecurityPlus. An annual risk assessment might be for HIPAA or even PCI. However, annual assessments may not be sufficient depending on the size of your organization. You may need to do quarterly risk assessments. Think of the largest banks out there. They will probably do quarterly risk assessments to ensure that their risk assessment is properly and adequate. This is a little more proactive, and it helps them address new threats and vulnerabilities as they arise. And then some go as far as continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring are for critical infrastructure or high volume assets. And this is a real-time strategy trying to use automated tools to scan for vulnerabilities or detect potential threats. Other things that could also be triggered would be after a security incident. After a breach or an attack, an organization should perform a risk assessment. Maybe an introduction of new technology within their organization. Maybe it's new software, hardware, or even cloud services. A risk assessment will ensure that the organization understands any new vulnerabilities. Or lastly, it could be organization changes like mergers or acquisitions, or changes within the business processes that should prompt a risk assessment from being completed. So let's talk about risk identification. Risk identification is the first and most critical step in the risk management process. It helps us recognize and document potential threats, vulnerabilities, and other factors that can negatively impact our organizational operations. Remember, we're trying to protect assets, data, or even our reputation. So what are we looking for here? Well, the first thing we're going to be looking for is threats. Threats are the external or even internal factors that can exploit the vulnerability to cause us harm. They can come from a lot of different sources, and remember the section on threat actors. It could be cyber criminals, malicious insiders, natural disasters, or even system failures. We need to identify our assets. Our assets are valuable to us, and they need to be protected. They could be hardware, software, intellectual property, personnel, or even data. We need to also identify the potential impact, or other known as the consequences that damage could happen to our organization. So if a threat successfully exploits a vulnerability, how much damage could that impact organization? So how do we do this? Well, we use a couple different methods. One of the first methods we do is called threat modeling. Threat modeling is a process for identifying potential threats to a system. It helps us understand how attackers might exploit vulnerabilities and what methods they might use. By mapping out these threats, we can anticipate potential attack vectors and prioritize our defenses. Next, we may use a vulnerability assessment to ensure that we're actively scanning our systems, our networks, or applications to identify any security weaknesses. This could be automated or used through our threat hunting techniques. We may be looking for things like outdated software, unpatched systems, or even misconfigurations. Penetration testing, otherwise known as ethical hacking, is a way that we can simulate an attack on our system to help identify new vulnerabilities and how they can be exploited. Pen testers would attempt to exploit the vulnerabilities to assess the effectiveness of our security measures and identify areas that we may need to improve. We could do security audits. A security audit is the evaluation of our policies, controls, and procedures, which we've been talking about during this section, and make sure that we're in compliance with regulatory requirements. We may want to look at our asset inventory to identify all hardware and software and data that needs to be protected. Think about like data classification. We need to understand if an asset does exist, where is it located, who has access to that, and what can the organization do to better fix some of the risks associated with that asset. We may look at incident response and incident reports. By looking at past incidents or breaches, we can help identify additional risks or vulnerabilities and ensuring that we do not fall prey to the same or similar incident. And then finally, we can bring in expert consultation. Consulting with external cybersecurity experts or internal teams can help us bring valuable insights and show some emerging threats and vulnerabilities. Experts can help us identify the risks, but that we may not have considered on an internal only assessment. So the risk register. This is what we're going to use. The risk register is a critical point that we basically centralize and document all risks identified during the risk assessment process. Now that we finish this, we now know what risks we might be vulnerable to, and then we can go further into it. The risk register itself is going to show the risk ID, a description, the category, the likelihood on how the risk could occur, normally rated in 1 through 5. The impact, also rated through 1 through 5, 5 being the largest impact. The risk score, which is done by likelihood times impact. For example, a risk score of 15 would have like a likelihood of 3 and an impact of 5. The risk owner, the person or team responsible for maintaining the risk and ensuring that mitigation strategies are implemented. Mitigation plans and controls, either plans on how we're going to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk. Risk status, whether such as like open, mitigated, under review, or closed. And when should we review this risk again? So here's an example of the risk register. You can have a risk ID, you can have a risk description, category, the likelihood, the impact, the risk score, risk owner, mitigation plan, the status, and the next review plan. And here's how we calculate risk score. We will take the likelihood, 1 being unlikely, 5 being definite, and the consequence, otherwise known as the impact, as 1 being insignificant, 5 being catastrophic, and multiply them together. If for some reason we have a 5 and a 5, we've got an extreme risk, act now. But if let's say we have a 1 and a 3, we multiply that together, we get 3, which is going to be a low risk, no further action. But as we move up through the risk, we may have to identify different strategies to mitigate this risk. And one of the first things we do is we use qualitative analysis. So qualitative analysis is used to assess and prioritize risks based on their likelihood and impact, typically using subjective judgment rather than numerical data. Okay, that's the definition. What does it mean? Well, we're going to be basing things off of levels. As I said, we're looking for subjective evaluation. We're looking for the risks that are going to be classified as low, medium, or high with likelihood and impact. We're not using numerical values here. We're going to use as risk classification. We're going to look at how often, what would we need to do to make it easier for us to prioritize? Is this technical, operational? Could we just get away with a legal policy or something like that nature? Is there human risk involved? Be aware if you're taking a CompTIA exam, anything that has human risk is always number one. We need to rank these risks based on their importance. Basically, now we have a list, right? From things that needs the most attention to the stuff that needs the least attention. And then finally, we'll have expert judgment. These are the stakeholders, the experts, the staff to help us identify what is the most important for our organization. Okay. So what does this look like? Well, first we're going to do our risk identification. We're going to come up with our likelihood, but remember, likelihood is no longer numbers. It's going to be low, medium, or high. We could have our impact of how much impact is it going to go to the organization. Then we're going to have our risk matrix, right? It could be a low, moderate, high, severe, something in that nature. And then we'll come up with our last thing, which is going to be our score, which basically helps us prioritize all these risks from the highest priority to the lowest. Why do we like qualitative? Well, it's simple. Qualitative analysis is faster and easier to perform than quantitative analysis because it relies on subjective judgment rather than detailed data collection. It's fast. It's collaborative. We want to make sure that we're asking people around us. Collaboration across departments. It relies on expert judgment and input from all the different various holders in the organization. It helps us prioritize resources. So by looking at this, we now know which resources we need to allocate the most effort to. And then finally, qualitative methods are adaptable because, well, it depends on the organization. Certain organizations may have a high risk appetite, which means we need to protect things more, while other organizations may not have that high risk appetite and may not need to protect their assets as much. That brings us to the next stage. We've got quantitative analysis. Now this is talking about numerical values. So we can look at monetary loss, probabilities, and statistical data. Quantitative equals numbers, while qualitative equals labels. Okay. So we need to know some data. We need to know some numbers. First thing we need to know is asset value. How much is the asset worth to us? Often expressed in monetary value. So if it's $1 million, it's $1 million. We need to know the exposure factor. This is the percentage of the asset's value that would be at risk if we lost it. Exposure factor represents the extent of damage that a threat could do. Not always written as 100%, maybe it's only 50%. We need to know what single loss expectancy is. How much money would we lose for a single occurrence of the threat? We need to look at ARO, annual rate of occurrence. How often does this happen per year? We need to look at annual loss expectancy. So in a given year, how do we determine how much money would be lost annually? Risk mitigation costs. How much money do we spend to protect it? And residual costs. Even after protections, sometimes there's still a loss if it does occur. What would that look like? All right, so there's going to be some equations that you're going to need to know on this. As much as I know many of you are not math majors, there is some math that we need to figure out. So first thing we need to know is single loss expectancy equals the asset value times the exposure factor. How much money will we lose from a single occurrence of the threat? For example, if the asset costs us $1 million, The exposure factor could take out 25%. Then our single loss expectancy would be $250,000. This is the equation. Remember it. It's tested upon quite often on SecurityPlus. We also need to know about annual loss expectancy. So if we have $250,000, but the annual rate of occurrence is once every 10 years, how often would it happen every year? Well, if it happens one time, it's $250,000. Once every 10 years, we divide it by 10. We're left with $25,000 a year. That is what we would expect to lose every year with a certain type of risk. So here's an example. I've got a customer database. It's worth $1 million. Exposure factor is 60%. We would lose 60% of the $1 million database if it was breached. And our annual rate of occurrence is 0.1, otherwise known as 1 out of 10 years. So what is the SLE? Well, if we take $1 million, we multiply it by 60%, we should get $600,000. If we take that $600,000, multiply it by 0.1 for 1 out of every 10 years, we should get $60,000 an annual loss expectancy. And here's what those equations look like. So what if we bought a solution? The company is considering implementing a $20,000 a year encryption solution that would reduce the factor from 60% to 10%. What would that look like? Well, our SLE would be different, right? Because we have $1 million asset. We would only lose 10%, which means we have a $100,000 SLE. So if every single loss expectancy is $100,000 and the annual rate of occurrence is every 10 years, if we divide it by 10, we would then get 10,000 for an ALE. It looks like this. So then they may ask you, what's the residual risk? Well, it used to cost us $60,000 every one of these incidents. We have $10,000 left over of an annual loss expectancy. It costs us $20,000 a year for encryption, so it costs us $30,000 a year. But if we take $60,000, what it used to cost us, and we take off $30,000, we have a $30,000 savings. This means we are going to buy the encryption because we are saving money by buying the encryption. If the encryption costs too much and ended up being, let's say the encryption costs $70,000, then we would spend more than the actual attack, so we would not buy the protection. So let's talk a little bit more about risk management strategies. Now, I am going to jump ahead a little bit because we talked about quantitative and qualitative analysis. Make sure that you understand what they are and how they're calculated, because you may be asked on the SecurityPlus to calculate one of these questions. Risk management strategies is the method or approach used to handle the risk in cybersecurity. Anything we do to protect ourselves from financial losses, and it helps us make more informed decisions on if we should allocate some resources to our protections. The strategies that we use in cybersecurity are avoidance. Avoidance is eliminating the activities or conditions that could lead to a risk. For instance, if a certain software is vulnerable, but their competitor software is not vulnerable, maybe we migrate to the competitor software and get rid of the vulnerable software. This helps us avoid having the vulnerabilities within our network. Mitigation. Mitigation is the likelihood of reducing the impact of a risk. we're not really eliminating the risks, but we're creating a strategy on reducing the risk to an acceptable level. Think of it like our firewall rule. We still had $10,000 of risk, but buying the $20,000 of encryption helps us mitigate most of that risk, which allows us, instead of worrying about $60,000 a year, to worry about $30,000 a year. Next, we have risk transfer. This is the way that we shift the responsibility from one company to another. Think of a third party. And you do this every day. Car insurance is transferring the risk from you to the insurance company. By paying a small premium, they will cover you for a certain amount of risk. And if you got in a car accident, they're the ones who will be paying out the bill. Now, lastly, we've got risk acceptance. Sometimes risk is just too great. We are looking for a way to mitigate or avoid or even transfer the risk, but it costs too much money. So instead of buying the protections, we just accept the risk is there and live with it. Okay? So acceptance is something that we will do as a security group, because sometimes to protect it costs too much. It outweighs the cost of the assets. And lastly, we sometimes will mix our strategies. We might mitigate, but we might accept any residual risk that may occur. All right, let's talk a little bit about risk monitoring and reporting. So we need to identify key risk indicators. Key risk indicators are one of those things that we're doing to help identify any of the measurable values for specific risks. Maybe we can get some early warning signs, or even find that we have ineffective mitigation strategies. For instance, the number of failed login attempts can be a key RI for unauthorized access risks. We'll look at the data. We need to then monitor and gather the data from all the different sources. It could be from logs, security tools, employee reports, network, third-party, threat intelligence feeds, wherever they may came from. We want to bring that into a single pane of glass. We can then analyze the trends, and this could be over time or looking for patterns to try to help predict when a risk may come critical. And then we can then respond to changes. When the risk is increased or the controls become ineffective, we can take action and deploy either additional security measures, update our policies, or address newly identified vulnerabilities. Lastly, we need to make sure that with our continuous risk monitoring, we are updating our risk register. They could be new risks, risk statuses, or even mitigation strategies that may be updated. And then we need to make sure that all stakeholders are up to date with the current risks. Okay. Now, there are different tools that we're going to use to do this, and one of them is going to be the Security Information Event Management System. A SIEM collects and analyzes log data from multiple sources and brings it to a single pane of glass, so that way we can see it. We can use threat intelligent platforms, and threat intelligent platforms are online research platforms that will help us determine, hey, what are the current incidents out there? Are there any new threats, or providing any insights to anything that's new? We can actively scan our network using a vulnerability scanner like Nessus or Qualys. These can help us identify new known vulnerabilities and generate reports to ensure that we take care of them on a timely fashion. And then lastly, we can have the incident response platform like Palo Alto Cortex to help organizations manage and report on security incidents. This incident tracking will help our team respond and document incidents in real time. Okay. Now, if you're in the class, this is where we're going to start our Kahoot. Thank you for joining into the Security Plus about risk management. And the next episode that we're going to be talking about will be third-party vendor management.